Chris thought his life was perfect, a loving wife, 2 beautiful children, and a stable career. But when a stray text message exposes Rebecca's months-long affair, his world unravels. Fueled by anger and heartbreak, Chris meticulously gathers evidence and confronts her in a public revelation that leaves no room for denial. Divorce seems inevitable, but just as Chris begins to rebuild his life, Rebecca returns with a shocking secret: she's battling a terminal illness. Now, Chris must navigate a tangled web of betrayal, love, and loss, grappling with whether to support the woman who broke his heart or protect himself from further pain. As the clock runs out, both are forced to confront the fragility of life, the depths of forgiveness, and the haunting legacy of their choices. Intimate, raw, and deeply human, this story explores how even the deepest wounds can be entwined with unbreakable bonds. It was a Thursday night, and the house was quieter than usual. Rebecca was still at work, or so she said. Our 2 kids, Lily and Jack, were asleep upstairs, their soft breathing audible in the otherwise silent house. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my laptop, trying to focus on the report due for work the next day. But my mind was elsewhere. Rebecca had been acting strange for weeks now. At first, it was subtle, an unexplained late night here, a distant look there. I chalked it up to stress. Her pharmaceutical sales job had always been demanding, with its endless dinners, conferences, and client meetings. But lately, there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. The doubts began gnawing at me the night she came home late from one of her meetings. She was dressed impeccably, her hair and makeup still fresh as if she'd just stepped out of a salon. She smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and told me she was exhausted, heading straight to the shower. There was nothing in her demeanor that screamed guilt, but something felt off. That night, I lay awake long after Rebecca had fallen asleep. The sound of her even breathing next to me was strangely oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something crucial. I wanted to confront her, but how do you question someone you've trusted with your entire life? How do you accuse your partner, the mother of your children, without proof? The opportunity came a week later. Rebecca's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter as I prepared breakfast. She was in the shower, and I was pouring coffee when the screen lit up. My eyes caught the notification before I could look away, a message from someone named Nick. It read, "Last night was amazing. Can't wait for next Thursday, R." The coffee pot slipped from my hand, the glass shattering on the counter. Hot liquid spread across the marble surface, burning my skin as I tried to mop it up. My mind was racing. Nick. Who was Nick? Rebecca had mentioned a colleague named Nick once, in passing. Could it be him? I didn't dare open the message. Instead, I cleaned up the mess as quickly as possible, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time Rebecca came downstairs, I had convinced myself it could be a misunderstanding. I watched her carefully as she kissed my cheek and grabbed her coffee. She didn't seem nervous or guilty, just her usual polished and composed self. But that only deepened my suspicion. The doubts festered over the next few days, eating away at me. I found myself watching her more closely, noting every detail of her behavior. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was imagining things, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave. The turning point came when Rebecca announced yet another late meeting. I offered to pick her up afterward, but she waved me off with an apologetic smile. "It's just work," she said. "Don't wait up." That night, instead of heading to bed, I logged onto our shared phone plan account and began combing through her call and text records. It didn't take long to find him, Nick. His number appeared frequently, often during the hours she claimed to be at work or out with clients. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the timestamps, the pattern becoming painfully clear. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was going on, and I needed to know the truth. But confronting Rebecca outright would lead nowhere. I needed proof, something concrete that couldn't be explained away. The next day, while Rebecca was at work, I took her phone while she was in the shower and installed a tracking app. I hated myself for it. It felt like a violation of her privacy, but what choice did I have? My instincts told me she wasn't being honest, and I needed answers. The app worked like a charm. By the end of the week, I knew exactly where she was going during her so-called meetings. Hotels. Not restaurants, not offices, but hotels. I even drove past one of them, parking across the street and watching as she walked inside. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, one that clung to her figure in a way that made my throat tighten. She looked radiant, and completely oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. I stayed in the car for hours, my thoughts spiraling. By the time she emerged, arm in arm with a man who could only be Nick, my suspicion had hardened into certainty. They laughed together as they walked to her car, and he kissed her on the cheek before she drove away. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. I had seen enough. When she got home that night, I acted as though nothing had changed. I greeted her with a kiss and asked how her meeting went. She smiled and said it was productive. The ease with which she lied made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to confront her, but I held back. Not yet. I needed to be smarter, more calculated. I needed to make her feel the weight of her betrayal, not in an angry outburst, but in a way she would never forget. The days that followed were a haze of quiet rage and meticulous planning. I was a man living two lives. By day, I was the devoted husband and father, helping Lily with her school project and cheering at Jack's soccer practice. By night, I was consumed with uncovering the full extent of Rebecca's betrayal. The tracking app provided a map of her movements, a damning trail of evidence. Every Thursday night, without fail, she'd check into the same hotel. Sometimes for an hour, sometimes for 3. It was painfully predictable, a ritual she clearly thought she was getting away with. But it wasn't enough to know where she went. I needed tangible proof, something she couldn't deny or twist into an argument about how I didn't understand her needs. So, one Thursday evening, instead of sitting at home stewing in silence, I parked outside the hotel. Hidden in the shadows, I waited. My heart pounded against my ribs as I watched the entrance, my palms slick with sweat despite the chill of the evening air. Rebecca arrived exactly when I expected her, wearing the same red dress she'd worn the first night I'd seen her with him. She didn't see me, didn't even glance in my direction as she confidently strode inside. 10 minutes later, he arrived. Nick. The man whose messages I'd read, whose smug face I now saw in the flesh. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered with an air of self-assuredness that made my blood boil. They didn't leave together that night. When Rebecca came out, I made sure to get photos, clear, incriminating evidence of her betrayal. My stomach churned as I snapped the pictures, each shutter clicked like a knife twisting in my gut. I told myself I was doing this for a reason, for justice, but it didn't make the act any less painful. That night, Rebecca came home and kissed me on the cheek as usual. I wanted to scream at her, demand to know how she could live such a double life, but I didn't. I smiled back, letting her think she'd fooled me yet again. It wasn't time to confront her, not yet. Over the next week, I focused on the logistics of my plan. I consulted a lawyer, ensuring I had everything in place to protect myself and the kids. I gathered financial documents, emails, and even old messages Rebecca had sent me during the times she'd been with Nick. The irony was almost unbearable, her words of love and devotion sent from the same hotel room where she betrayed me. Then came the hardest part, deciding when and how to reveal what I knew. I didn't want a screaming match, something our kids might overhear. No, this had to be controlled, deliberate, and above all, public. Rebecca needed to feel the full weight of her choices, not just from me, but from everyone she'd deceived. Her birthday was approaching, and she'd been dropping hints about wanting a big celebration. It was perfect. I told her I'd throw a dinner party, inviting close friends and family. She was delighted, completely oblivious to the real reason I was so eager to organize the event. The day of the party arrived, and I went about the preparations with a calmness that surprised even me. Rebecca spent most of the afternoon at the spa, returning home just in time to get dressed and greet the guests. She looked stunning, as always, her smile radiant as she welcomed everyone into our home. The party was a success, or so it seemed. Laughter filled the room, and Rebecca basked in the attention, completely unaware of what was coming. I waited until the cake had been cut, until everyone had settled into their seats with glasses of champagne, before standing to make a toast. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began, raising my glass. "Rebecca and I are grateful to have such wonderful friends and family in our lives. Tonight, I'd like to share a few words about love, trust, and the bonds that hold us together." Rebecca beamed at me, her eyes shining with what she must have thought was love. I almost faltered, almost let the moment slip away, but then I remembered the hotel, the texts, the lies. I pushed forward. For 15 years, I thought our marriage was built on those principles. I thought we were a team, partners in every sense of the word. But recently, I've discovered that trust can be fragile. And when it's broken, it's not always obvious at first. Sometimes, it takes time to see the cracks. The room grew quiet. Rebecca's smile faltered, confusion clouding her features. I reached under the table and pulled out a folder, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," I said, my voice steady, "is what betrayal looks like." I placed the folder on the table and opened it, revealing the photos of Rebecca and Nick, the hotel receipts, the screenshots of their messages. Gasps echoed around the room as our guests leaned forward, craning their necks to see. Rebecca's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what was happening. "Chris," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my composure slipping for the first time. "Explain how you've been lying to me, to our kids, to everyone here." "Go ahead, Rebecca. Explain." The room was deathly silent as Rebecca struggled for words. She looked around, her gaze darting from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Her best friend, Amanda, looked horrified. My brother shook his head in disbelief. Even her parents sat frozen, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "It was a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, my voice rising. "A mistake that lasted months. That involved countless lies and betrayals." "Don't insult me, Rebecca." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt no sympathy. This wasn't about her pain. It was about justice, about making her face the consequences of her actions. "I've packed your things," I said, my tone cold. "They're in the garage. You can stay at a hotel tonight, perhaps one you've been to before. I'll be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning." Rebecca opened her mouth to protest, but I didn't give her the chance. "This party is over," I said, turning to our guests. "Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry it had to end this way." One by one, our friends and family filed out, their expressions a mix of shock and pity. Rebecca stood frozen in the middle of the room, tears still streaming down her face. When the last guest had gone, I turned to her. "Get out," I said simply. And she did. The house was eerily silent after Rebecca left. The remnants of the party, a half-eaten cake, champagne glasses, and scattered napkins, felt like ghostly relics of a life that had just imploded. I stood in the living room, staring at the closed front door, unsure of what I felt. Relief? Anger? Sadness? Perhaps all three at once. I made my way upstairs, careful not to wake Lily and Jack. They were blissfully unaware of what had just transpired, tucked into their beds like nothing in the world could hurt them. I envied their innocence, their ability to sleep peacefully while my mind churned through the events of the evening. Our room, felt like a battlefield. Rebecca's side of the closet was empty now, her clothes hastily packed into the suitcases I'd left in the garage. Her scent still lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, a cruel reminder of what I'd lost and what I could no longer tolerate. Sleep was impossible. I sat in the dark, staring at my phone, scrolling through old photos of us. There we were on our honeymoon, laughing on a beach in Mexico. Rebecca's smile in those pictures was so genuine, so full of life, that it was hard to reconcile it with the woman who had lied to me for months. How did we get here? How did she get here? Morning came too quickly. The kids woke up, bright-eyed and ready for their Saturday routine. I plastered on a smile, made them pancakes, and pretended everything was fine. When Jack asked where Mom was, I told him she'd left early for a work trip. The lie tasted bitter, but I wasn't ready to tell them the truth, not yet. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. I busied myself with chores, trying to fill the void Rebecca had left behind. But no matter how many errands I ran or how many things I cleaned, I couldn't escape the gnawing sense of betrayal. Every room in the house reminded me of her, of the life we'd built together and the lies she'd buried beneath it. By Monday morning, I was sitting in my lawyer's office, the evidence spread out before us. Her name was Karen Blake, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in family law. She flipped through the photos and documents with a practiced eye, nodding occasionally but saying little. "This is more than enough," she finally said, closing the folder. "With these, we can establish adultery as grounds for divorce. And since you've documented her absences so thoroughly, we'll have a strong case for primary custody of the children." Hearing it laid out so plainly made it all feel real. This wasn't just a nightmare I could wake up from. It was my life now, a life I hadn't asked for but would have to navigate all the same. "Do I have to tell her I'm filing?" I asked, my voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Karen nodded. "Yes, she'll be served the papers, but it doesn't have to be face-to-face. We can arrange for a process server to deliver them. It's cleaner that way." I agreed, grateful for the distance that would provide. The thought of confronting Rebecca again, of hearing her excuses and apologies, was unbearable. I wanted this over with as quickly and painlessly as possible, for me, and for the kids. That night, as I sat alone in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Rebecca. "We need to talk. Please, Chris. Just give me a chance to explain." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to block her number and shut her out completely. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for 15 years, couldn't let go that easily. "There's nothing to explain," I finally typed. "You made your choices. Now I'm making mine." Her response came almost immediately. "It wasn't what you think. It was a mistake. I love you, Chris. I love our family. Please don't do this." I didn't reply. What was there to say? Her actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings with my lawyer, phone calls with Rebecca's parents, and awkward conversations with mutual friends who had heard about the party. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but none of it mattered to me. I was focused on protecting my children and reclaiming some semblance of normalcy. Then, one evening, as I was tucking Lily into bed, she asked a question that broke my heart. "Is Mommy coming back?" I froze, unsure how to answer. Her big brown eyes stared up at me, full of trust and confusion. She was too young to understand what was happening, but she could sense the shift in our home, the absence of her mother. "I don't know, sweetheart," I finally said, stroking her hair. "But no matter what happens, Daddy's here. I'm not going anywhere." That seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. But as I left her room, I couldn't shake the guilt that weighed heavily on my chest. No matter how justified I felt in my anger, the kids were the ones caught in the crossfire. They didn't deserve this. A week later, Rebecca was served with the divorce papers. She showed up at the house that evening, her eyes red from crying. I let her in, more out of politeness than anything else. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and laughter, and begged me to reconsider. "Chris, I'll do anything," she said, her voice breaking. "Counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't throw this all away." I wanted to laugh at the irony. Throw this all away. That's exactly what she'd done the moment she started sneaking off to hotels with Nick. "It's too late, Rebecca," I said, my voice cold. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." She sobbed, her tears falling onto the divorce papers spread out before her. But I didn't feel pity. Not anymore. The woman I'd loved, the woman I'd built a life with, was gone. In her place was a stranger I no longer recognized. As she left that night, I felt a strange sense of closure. The pain was still there, raw and unrelenting, but so was a spark of something new, hope. Hope that I could rebuild, that I could create a life for myself and my kids that wasn't tainted by lies and betrayal. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt ready to face it. The weeks following Rebecca's departure were filled with a mix of small victories and quiet sadness. I had established a routine for the kids, ensuring their lives remained as normal as possible amidst the upheaval. We made pancakes on Saturdays, had movie nights on Fridays, and worked together on school projects. It was comforting, even if it didn't completely fill the void. Rebecca and I communicated only when necessary, mostly about the kids. Her texts were always laced with regret and apologies, but I kept my responses short and to the point. My lawyer was handling the divorce proceedings, and the end of our marriage felt inevitable, like a train I couldn't stop. One chilly evening in late November, I found myself sitting alone on the back porch, a glass of whiskey in hand. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that made you feel alive. The kids were at my parents' house for the weekend, and the silence of the house was deafening. I thought I'd enjoy the quiet, but instead, it left too much room for my thoughts. I stared at the stars, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. We had been happy once, or at least, I thought we had. Was there something I could have done differently? Was I too focused on work, too blind to the cracks that had been forming in our marriage? The questions looped endlessly, offering no answers. As I sat there, my phone buzzed on the table beside me. I picked it up and saw Rebecca's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello. Chris," her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. I need to see you. Please." There was something in her tone that unsettled me. "Rebecca, it's late. If this is about the kids, we can talk tomorrow." "No," she said quickly. "It's not about the kids. I just need to talk to you. Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed. "Fine. Come over." I hung up and sat there, the unease settling deep in my chest. When Rebecca arrived, she looked pale and disheveled, a shadow of the vibrant woman I had once known. She stepped onto the porch, clutching a folder in her trembling hands. "Chris," she began, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I've destroyed everything. But there's something you need to know." She handed me the folder, and I opened it cautiously. Inside were medical documents, scans, and a diagnosis that made my blood run cold. "I went to the doctor a few weeks ago," she said, her eyes welling with tears. "I haven't been feeling well, and they found something. It's aggressive. Stage 4. I stared at the papers, the words blurring together as my mind struggled to process what she was saying. "Rebecca, are you saying?" "I have cancer, Chris," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't have much time." The weight of her words crushed me, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. This was the woman who had betrayed me, who had torn our family apart. And yet, in that moment, all I could see was the mother of my children, the woman I had once loved, standing before me, broken and terrified. "What do you need from me?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "I need you to help me make this right," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Not for me, for the kids. They need to know I love them. They need to remember me as their mom, not as the woman who ruined everything." I didn't answer immediately. My mind was racing, torn between anger, pity, and the deep ache of old love. Finally, I nodded. "We'll figure it out." The next few months were a blur of hospital visits, treatments, and difficult conversations. Rebecca moved back into the house, not as my wife, but as the mother of my children. We didn't talk much about the past, focusing instead on creating memories for Lily and Jack. We went on family outings, took photos, and made sure the kids felt surrounded by love. Rebecca's condition worsened quickly. By the time spring arrived, she was bedridden, her once vibrant spirit dimmed by the relentless disease. The kids visited her often, their innocence shielding them from the full gravity of the situation. I stayed by her side, not out of obligation, but because some part of me still cared. One evening, as the sun set in hues of orange and pink, Rebecca called me into her room. Her voice was weak, but her eyes held a glimmer of the woman I had once known. "Chris," she whispered, "thank you for everything." I sat beside her, taking her frail hand in mine. "Rebecca, you don't have to thank me." "Yes, I do," she insisted. "I made so many mistakes, but you gave me this. You gave me a chance to make things right." Tears filled my eyes, and I nodded, unable to speak. She smiled faintly, her breathing shallow. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything." "I know," I whispered, squeezing her hand. "I know." That night, Rebecca passed away peacefully, surrounded by the family she had hurt but also loved. The kids didn't fully understand, but they clung to me as we navigated the painful days that followed. In the end, life didn't offer the neat resolutions I had hoped for. The betrayal and the pain didn't vanish, but neither did the love and memories we had shared. Rebecca's death left a hole in our lives, one that could never truly be filled. As I tucked the kids into bed one night, Lily looked up at me with tearful eyes. "Is Mommy happy now?" I nodded, my throat tight. "I think she is, sweetheart. I think she is." And in that moment, I realized that life is messy, filled with contradictions and complexities. Love and betrayal, pain and forgiveness, they all coexist, shaping us in ways we can't always understand. But we move forward, carrying the weight of it all, and somehow, we keep going.